Good morning to all my fellow virtual workshop attendees. My name is Karl McArthur. I'm a supervising engineer with the City of Austin's Watershed Protection Department Floodplain Office. I wish we could be doing this in person today, partly because my dentist should be putting the finishing touches on a crown about the time you're watching this, but mostly because I miss seeing all my colleagues from the wonderful world of water resources. So I have the privilege to be giving the first of 3 presentations about large floodplain study efforts that are being conducted primarily in response to NOAA Atlas 14, but also for some other reasons. And I look forward to being on the panel discussion later in the program with Atal and Aaron, who will be giving the other 2 presentations on this general topic. So as I go through my presentation this morning, I'll be answering these 7 questions, starting off by beating what is most likely a dead horse. I'm sure all of y'all have heard of Atlas 14 and know what it is, but I'll go over it briefly. Then talk about what the city has done so far in response to Atlas 14, what we're going to do through our floodplain studies, and then where we go from there. So what is NOAA Atlas 14? Obviously, it's an update of the extreme rainfall study for the state of Texas. NOAA, in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers and various others, developed a new atlas and published it, the final version, in September of 2018. And it includes rainfall data up through the year 2017, including Hurricane Harvey. So this supersedes technical paper 40, which was published in 1969, and also the USGS rainfall study for Texas, originally published in 96 and then updated with fancy maps in 2004. That study used data up through 1994, and that's what the City of Austin had previously used to establish our design rainfall criteria. So obviously this adds a considerable amount more rainfall data, incorporates more gauges that have sufficient period of record to be analyzed, and hopefully provides us a better estimate of what the extreme rainfall we can expect to be is. So as the map shows, and that map is the 24-hour, 100-year rainfall increases relative to technical paper 40. And as you can see, there's significant increases from San Antonio area through Austin over to Houston and then down along the coast, with Houston seeing by far the largest of the increases, but they're still significant in the Austin area as well. In Austin, we're looking at an increase of about 2.5 inches in our 100-year 24-hour design storm. So from about 10.2 inches to around 12.8 inches, depending on where you are in the city. And then also in our 500-year, we're seeing an increase over 5 inches. So going from around 13.2 to around 19 inches, and that'll have ramifications on our studies that I'll talk about a little later. But I want to point out one thing here, that Atlas 14, 12.8 inches, and our previous 500-year 13.2 inches. And I'll talk a little more about that in a slide or two. Oh, what are we doing here in the city of Austin about Atlas 14? Our first step, we wanted to get out in front of things as much as we could. We wanted to prevent as much development in what we knew would ultimately be the regulatory floodplain, and we went through the process of updating our land development code in an effort to do that, and also incorporated a couple of other tweaks to our regulations that I'll talk about. Second step was updating our drainage criteria so that all the storm drains, channels, and everything is designed based on Atlas 14 rainfall, design rainfall data. Step 3, which I'll spend most of the time this morning talking about, is determining flood risk. So that's our new studies, updating to include Atlas 14. And then step 4, once we're done with the studies, working with FEMA to produce our new flood insurance rate mapping for the Austin area. And throughout this whole process, one of the key things is informing the public and the engineering community about what Atlas 14 is, what we're doing with it, and what impact that's going to have on them. And I'll touch on that throughout the presentation. Step 1, updating the land development code. Back on slide 3, I mentioned the 500-year, our previous 500-year rainfall of 13.2 inches relative to our Atlas 14 100-year rainfall of 12.8. And those are relatively close. So we decided to take advantage of data that we already had, and then to redefine on an interim basis, our 100-year regulatory floodplain as the FEMA 500-year floodplain, since those rainfall amounts are relatively close. And we think the 500-year FEMA floodplain will be a decent representation of what the Atlas 1400-year rainfall or floodplain will be. And also with a 25-year floodplain, so the city of Austin doesn't map floodways, but we do map a 25-year floodplain that we use kind of as a surrogate. We're a no-rise community, so no rise is allowed regardless, without variances. So the floodway we don't need quite so much because of that. But for that 25-year, the Atlas 14 25-year rainfall is relatively close to our previous 100-year rainfall. So as a surrogate for our 25-year floodplain, we're using the City of Austin, old City of Austin 100-year. So again, until we can get the new studies done. So from the perspective of the engineering community, they can either use the current 500-year FEMA floodplain and modeling, or they can go ahead and incorporate Atlas 14 rainfall data into the models and update it for that. That has some challenges, which I'll talk about a little later. One of the big things that we did to kind of improve our ability to do small site mitigation was creating a residential redevelopment exception. So our rules include a provision for a requirement for safe access, and we define that as a path from the building to a right-of-way, all of which is a minimum of 1 foot above the floodplain. Obviously, for residential properties that are surrounded by floodplain, it becomes very difficult for them to achieve that safe access. What this redevelopment exception does is, provided that they meet all the other requirements, freeboard, structural certification, no adverse impact, compensation for volume, we can waive the safe access requirement. So that allows folks to elevate their homes, tear down and rebuild in a safer way, but it doesn't allow them to put additional units on a property. So we want houses to be safer, but we don't want to increase the density of habitation in the floodplain. We're also working on a commercial redevelopment exception that'll have some pretty tight boundaries, but that will help us on the commercial side in a similar way. We expanded an exception we have along the Colorado River. So the Colorado River in the Austin area is primarily controlled by Lake Travis and Mansfield Dam. So this also waives the safe access requirement within the 100-year floodplain of the Colorado, under the assumption that there'll be some warning for folks in this area. They'll be able to get out before the flood wave hits them from Mansfield Dam. And finally, we increased the required freeboard to 2 feet across the city. Previously, we'd required 2 feet if somebody wanted to pursue an administrative floodplain variance or in our central business area, but we wanted to make things consistent across the city. So we adopted 2 feet of freeboard, as we believe, as many do, that freeboard is one of the best ways to ensure safety in a flood event. Touching on the outreach part of things again, we held so many meetings to talk about our Atlas 14 code changes. Those included public meetings throughout the city in areas that would be impacted by the change, or most impacted by the change. We also met with realtors, we met with engineers, and like the slide says, we had over 150 various outreach meetings. And we also did some mailing campaigns, an initial one of about 25,000 postcards to folks in the area between the 100-year and 500-year, where we're expecting the Atlas 14 floodplain to cover. And then a subsequent mail out to everybody, property addresses and property owners within all of the floodplains. So that was about an 80,000 postcard mail out that we did recently. And then all leading up to council adopting the ordinance to incorporate those changes in November of 2019. And then our online version of the code has also been updated to reflect those changes. Step 2 was updating our drainage criteria manual so that engineers have the tools they need to make their designs compliant with Atlas 14 design rainfall. That included new depth, duration, frequency tables based on the Atlas 14 data. And We hired Fries and Nichols to help us with the development of the criteria, and working with them, we looked at several options and how to break out the rainfall data across the Austin area, because it varies in the 100-year 24-hour from about 13 inches, a little more at the south end, to a little under 11.5 inches at the north end of our jurisdiction area. So we went with various options to try to minimize the difference across areas. And ultimately, we arrived at dividing the city along the Colorado River, with a little exception there on the west end. So Zone 1 on the south ended up with a 100-year 24-hour rainfall of about 12.8 inches. Zone 2 to the north with a 100-year 24-hour rainfall of about 12.23 inches. Also developed new IDF curve coefficients for use in the rational methods, the ABC coefficients that you see in the TxDOT manual and in our drainage criteria manual. Updated the hyetograph that we're using for our hydrologic modeling, which is typically HEC HMS from the SCS type 3 to a frequency or balanced storm as it's implemented in HEC HMS. So we also provided a tabular form of that HMS balanced hyetograph for use in other programs. But if you look through the NOAA Atlas 14 publication, it talks about developing new hydrographs based on the rainfall data. That's the same process that was gone through to develop the SCS type 3 and regionalized. We did it specifically for Austin. And we also added guidance on how to handle what we're calling phased developments projects. So that's where a large development goes in, design their storm drain, design their ponds based on our previous criteria, and then have to deal with Atlas 14 on the subsequent phases. So that defines what they need to do with the downstream system and how they design on their site. And those drainage criteria manual changes became effective in January of this year, and just recently, within the past couple of weeks, the online version of our DCM has been updated to incorporate those changes. Step 3, determining flood risk. So this is the meat of the presentation, talking about our floodplain studies and the extent of those and some details about how we're going to be doing them. First off, which watersheds need to be updated to account for Atlas 14? Obviously, all of them. So this is going to be a big study effort that includes the entire city and its ETJ. And of course, when we go out to that extent, that's going to touch on a lot of other communities that will be impacted by our updates. And we've already started coordination with them, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But that's going to be a key component as we go through talking to those other communities, making sure we're all getting what we need out of these studies. Informing the public, again, is going to be a big part of what we do. So we'll get the word out early and as often as we can, and then talk more about the results of our study when we have those. And we'll be kicking off the first of our studies in early August. Once we have the models, what do we do with them? Again, inform the public of our new understanding of risk. It's going to be key. We'll start using those new studies as soon as they're finished and approved by the city for regulatory purposes. So we won't wait until the FEMA firm maps become effective. We'll go ahead and use those models for our regulatory purposes. We'll use the modeling and results internally, both our creek and local flood groups, for their prioritization of capital improvement projects to provide flood risk reduction. And again, we'll start using those models for all those purposes as soon as we have them and not wait for effective FEMA maps. Our modeling objectives, getting into some of the details of the analysis. Obviously, our new models are going to incorporate the Atlas 14 rainfall data. That'll be a significant change, especially with the 500-year rainfall. If you'll recall, we're going from about 13.2 inches to 19 inches in our 500-year floodplain. That's going to mean cross sections are going to have to get a lot broader, especially in the eastern parts of our area where the topography is a bit flatter. We're going to have to update all the routing region information as a result, have to update the pond routing data to ensure that we can adequately model the overflows from the ponds that are likely to occur with the Atlas 14 rainfall data. for the large regional ponds. We'll be updating our models with the latest topographic data using the 2017 LIDAR data that we've acquired in cooperation with TNRIS. One of the big things, this will allow us to have consistent methodologies and model versions throughout the city. Currently, we have some models that are still paper. Most of our models are in fairly recent version, but there's a variety of versions of HEC-HMS and RAS models across the city. It'll be nice to have one consistent version moving forward, and we will be using HMS and RAS as our primary tools for all this modeling effort. We'll be expanding our use of 2D modeling. The newer versions of HEC-RAS have obviously made that a much easier thing to do. We still plan to regulate to our 1D models, but we will be using those 2D models to help us figure out exactly what's going on in problem areas, confluences where we have overflows from the channel into shallow flooding areas, and then taking that information, informing our one-dimensional modeling and adjusting it to match as well as we can to the 2D modeling. We'll also be using that 2D modeling to define our AO shallow flooding zones. We'll have, in all likelihood, a number of those throughout the city, using that modeling data to establish those. And depending on how things go as we move along, we might find that there's some benefit to taking the step, at least a partial step, down the road to using 2D modeling for regulatory purposes, which is something that Atal will be speaking about in detail for the Harris County Flood Control District. And another key thing is we're going with all detailed mapping. So no more A zones anywhere within our jurisdictional area. It'll be all detailed either with survey or with field measurements, but all detailed floodplain mapping. We'll also have more complete coverage of floodplain mapping. We'll be including some streams that were previously unstudied. FEMA minimum standards typically take studies up to the square mile or 640 acre drainage point. Our floodplain regulations go up to the 64 acre drainage point. So wherever possible, we'll be extending our studies up to that point. So we have comprehensive modeling and flood risk information everywhere we regulate the floodplain. We'll be producing flood risk data sets that we'll use to facilitate our mitigation planning. Talked a little bit about our creek and local floods and what they do. They'll be using that data to prioritize which projects they work on and to help figure out what to do for flood risk reduction, with the overall goal being a comprehensive and consistent set of tools that we can use to identify flood risk, regulate to keep folks out of the floodplain, and to use in our mitigation planning. Give you a little feel for the areas we're talking about studying. This colorful map shows you how we're breaking out our study areas. That gray area near the bottom, that's Onion Creek. That'll be 2 studies to do the entirety of Onion Creek, which is about 355 square miles, and then breaking out our other studies across the city in as logical way as we can. And I'll get into talking a little bit more about this later, but the colorful ones kind of correspond to 2 HUC 10s. And I'll talk about that in connection with Water Development Board grant application. And then the green area at the top, that's the Upper Brushy Creek Watershed that we share jurisdiction with Williamson County, City of Cedar Park, Round Rock, and a variety of others. And for both that area and for Onion Creek, right around the beginning of this year, we got new effective firm maps. So it's going to be an interesting process with Onion. So people are going to say, didn't you just do this study? Why are you doing it again? So we'll have to explain the whys and talk about Atlas 14, and it'll give us more opportunities to do that. But the green area in Williamson County is going to take a lot of coordination with the other partners in that area. So we've got to have everybody on the same page to go ahead and take the plunge and update those new maps. And there's some discussion about using different rainfall amounts up there, because as I said, as you move further north, the Atlas 14 rainfall amounts decrease. So there'll be some additional coordination to be done up there. Just a quick summary of the areas we intend to study. From a drainage area perspective, we're looking at about 900 square miles of updated hydrology. And for our hydraulics, both, like I said, all will be detailed. So it's all going to be AE, either with survey or field measurements. We're looking at about 1,100 square miles of hydraulic study that takes us up to 64 acres as often as we can. From a 2D perspective, we're looking at give or take 36 square miles of two-dimensional modeling. So we're hoping that gives us a lot better information and helps us come up with better models in those challenging hydraulic areas. And also levees, flood walls. We have 2 of those in the city of Austin. One in Williamson Creek, one in Walnut Creek. Atlas 14 is going to cause us problems with freeboard, so we'll have to be looking at how we map that, since they're probably not going to have sufficient freeboard, and move into looking at ways to try to bring those back into compliance and providing full 100-year protection. Just a little overview of some of our potential 2D modeling areas. Like I said, a lot of those are at confluences or in areas where water tends to overflow from the mainstream through neighborhoods or from one stream to another. So we want to do as much two-dimensional modeling as we need to fully understand those areas. Oh, the mechanics of how we're going to do this. We're going to be using rotation list contracts. We have a 2015 rotation list with a total authority of about $3 million. And we'll be using that rotation list to study the Onion Creek watershed, that gray one, and its tributary watersheds. We've assigned 2 studies under that. We're getting very close to kicking off the first of those for the main stem of Onion, and we're getting close to finalizing the scope for the other study. And then we also have a 2020 rotation list that we've been working on. We're just in the final stages of wrapping up the contracting for that. And that rotation list, which has an authority of about 14 million, will be used to cover all the rest of the area. And hopefully for our participation in that area in Williamson County that I was talking about as well. The rotation list consultants, we selected 5. Those were approved by City Council back in March of this year. And something a little different from what we typically do, we selected a lead consultant, so the top scoring consultant is going to have some additional supporting roles on this work, including independent quality control, some of the FEMA coordination, helping establish the modeling standards, update our community rating system information as a result of these studies, and some other helpful services as we go along. Second major part of how we're going to do this is how we're going to pay for it. So for our funding components, the City of Austin has a drainage utility fee, and the funds from that fund the operations of our department, and will be a major component, a majority component most likely, of the funding that we use for these studies. Also, we have a FEMA Cooperating Technical Partner 2019 grant that'll be associated with the Onion Creek studies under our 2015 rotation list, and we're working in the final stages of a 2020 grant that'll be used for the studies that we do with our 2020 rotation list. And also we've applied for a Water Development Board grant for 2 HUCs, one of which is fully covered by what we're doing, and another one that includes some areas that are covered by some things that others are doing, and fingers crossed that we'll get funding through that as well. Third major component is going to be coordination. I talked about the impacts to other communities. This is going to have to be a team effort. There's about 17 impacted communities and counties that will be touched by these studies. And we've got some complementary efforts ongoing by other counties and communities. At least 3 of these have applied for, potentially applied for Water Development Board grant funding to expand on the studies. And in Bastrop, in cooperation with Travis County, is currently wrapping up a study that incorporates Atlas 14 for Wilbarger Creek and Maha Creek. So that rounds out one of the HUC 10s that is included in our application. So it'll be close coordination with all these communities. And if we get the Water Development Board funding, we can expand the studies to cover everything that anybody in those communities needs for their floodplain mapping purposes. Just quickly picture those impacted communities. The City of Austin highlighted in the dark black there, but as you can see, there's a lot of folks that will be touched by these studies. And then the final step, updating the FEMA firm maps. That's one of the reasons, one of the big reasons, in addition to funding, that we're working with FEMA through the Cooperating Technical Program, with the idea that that'll facilitate physical map revision process after we finish our studies. So obviously we'll be coordinating with them throughout. We'll be submitting all our stuff through the mapping information platform and doing all the things required for a FEMA project and submitting that data to FEMA. Once that's all done, we'll be working with them through the preliminary and post-preliminary process to respond to appeals and comments. Throughout, again, we'll be informing the public of the new understanding of flood risk, what these new maps look like, and then as we do that, waiting to get to the point of letter of final determination and then adopting the new maps. And we're hopeful that going through the CTP process, that'll be as efficient as it possibly can be. Quick look at how we envision the schedule. As I've mentioned, we've already got 2 assignments made under the 2015 rotation list. We're wrapping up the scoping and getting those kicked off now. And we'll be going through that assignment process for the 2020 rotation list and hope to have all those assignments made by the end of this fiscal year, and then scope development for all of our studies done by early in 2021. Engineering, we're looking at from our initial studies starting this August through October of 2022, and then the mapping and production of risk map products following that, and hopefully wrapping up around April of 23, and then coordinating with FEMA through the process to do physical map revisions. All right, so one last thing, and this is primarily for the engineering and development community, but which City of Austin models currently account for Atlas 14? None. That's why we're doing the study. That's why we have the interim definitions of the floodplain. So again, we don't have any models currently that incorporate Atlas 14. So the development community has to either use the FEMA 500 year or update Atlas 14 on their own. We're working obviously to resolve that as quickly as possible and have all those models available. So what do we do until they're updated? Again, engineers can use the FEMA 500 year floodplain and the associated models for that purpose, create their own Atlas 14 based models. And also, quick reminder, we have what we call the Flood Pro web application at www.atxfloodpro.com, and that's where we provide regulatory flood elevation information. We make our models available for download, both floodplain and storm drain modeling, and we've updated that tool and also our property profile web viewer tool to show the FEMA 500 year as our regulatory 100 year and our old City of Austin 100 year as the regulatory 25 year floodplain. And of course, for individual sites, engineers need to use the Atlas 14 drainage criteria. And that's all I have. If I have any further questions, feel free to contact me directly by my email or phone listed there, or contact our floodpro@austintexas.gov email with general questions, and a variety of us can get back to you from that. So I look forward to the panel discussion later today, and I'll hand you over to the next presentation. Thank you.